art museums, you may have seen his outdoor sculptures. They're large, black, geometric steel constructions. And so she grew up in that environment, and oftentimes she and her two sisters would sit and make maquettes for their father, folding little geometric shapes into different types of configurations. So you would think that Kiki would have had a very typical trajectory of becoming an artist, but she really didn't. She took some time in trade school to be an industrial maker. She lived for a while in San Francisco with the musical group The Tubes. After that, she moved to New York City, spent time as a cook, waitress, worked in a factory, doing airbrushing, and was even an electrician. But she spent 3 semesters at the Hartford Art School before dropping out. So her art career, her art training was a little bit less conventional than most. She did do some art classes like in printmaking at the Lower East Side Print Shop and Bob Blackburn printmaking workshops. So she did get some printmaking experience there. But probably one of the biggest impacts was working with a group of artists known as Collab, collaborative projects that included text-based artist Jenny Holzer, Jane Dixon, who's in our collection. Jane Dixon taught her how to make monotypes, the type of printmaking, and then Charles Abrams taught her how to do silk screens. So they were doing these very pretty simple prints in the late 70s, early 80s that were very politically driven. If you think about that time period, there was a lot of interest in gender politics in the art world, and also AIDS was epidemic at that time. But as I mentioned, the main theme or subject matter of her artwork was the body. And I'm going to show you something in comparison. It's probably what we think of as a typical, very traditional use of the body. And this is by Elmar Tacklinger, an Indiana muralist. And so we have a very naturalistic depiction. Probably Tacklinger learned to draw the body from a more traditional standpoint, life drawing classes, learning anatomy. Kiki Smith, on the other hand, did more learning about the body through actually being trained as an EMT, an emergency medical technician. Her sister wanted to become one, and so she took classes as well. So in a very different way, she learned about the body, more so in terms of the processes, also how the body fails and how it responds during trauma. One other point of comparison is one of Kiki Smith's contemporaries, Martha Mayer Erlenbacher. This was a piece done in 1985. Throughout a lot of the 20th century, we had artists exploring abstractions like Smith's father, but there was a return to interest in figuration in the 1980s, which Erlenbacher is an example of that. But Kiki Smith is a completely different case. I think of it in terms of Smith looks at the body from almost the inside out. We were looking at some very naturalistic depictions of the entire body. Smith even goes in microscopically into the body. This piece is entitled Black Flag by Kiki Smith from 1989. It's a lithograph, and what we're looking at is probably a human ovum with its protective cells around it. So we're looking very microscopically. And if you think about it, Smith working in the 1980s kind of follows the women's art movement. So a lot of women were interested in trying to depict the female experience, and Smith does that as well. Especially like this imagery, this is definitely a very female experience. My personal first exposure to Smith's work was in Oberlin College when back in the early 90s, and she had done a group of plaster casts of female pregnant bellies, and they just called them shields. So it was just a little kind of a condo shape, almost circular shape with just the belly itself. They were called shields. It was very descriptive, and so I really think it's interesting that Smith deals with fertility and raising children, and childbirth is a very natural, very universal part of human life, but it isn't something that you typically is that she explores things that are sometimes a little uncomfortable. Things are very universal. I mean, she is interested in bodily fluids and different body parts and things that maybe in general we will tend to hide rather than have on display, just like something like childhood. As we move along to one other thing to point out. Also, this is entitled Black Flag, so we do have this black field, and it is a horizontal shape, and we think of flags as being very, very public, the symbolic of the nation, and then you have it contrasted with something very intimate. Also, when we look at the print, we look at the edges, we see that she's done it on a handmade paper, and it's you see the irregular edges. It looks very fragile and frail, and that's very typical of a lot of the materials that Smith selects. She will select things that aren't very common. She'll choose to use work in plaster or terracotta because she is a sculptor as well as a printmaker. So I think that fragility connected with the body is an interesting dynamic because you've got the very powerful life force contrasted with still this fragility. And I think today, with everything going on, we're very much aware of, despite our knowledge in the medical field and technology, there still is that fragility of life. Now we can move on. So another piece we own is this untitled piece, and it's affectionately referred to as the hair print. And this is also a lithograph. This was done a year later in 1990. I have, as a comparison, a very typical traditional portrait by Gwen John. We're given a lot of information with Gwen's portrait as far as just the visual details of her face, maybe a sense of mood of the sitter. And if we look at Smith's work, maybe in the upper left corner and the upper right corners, you might start to see an eye and an ear. And so we have part of a face there, we've got her hair, and then part of a face here as well. And as I mentioned, Smith is a sculptor, and so it's interesting to think about how a sculptor works, a three-dimensional sculptor works in two dimensions, and how that person thinks. This is kind of, I think, what I would think traditionally how a sculptor might think. This is by Elizabeth Catlett, where she does a lot of wood carving, and she is working in the same time period. She just passed away in 2012, so this is from 1980. And so she's got a study from one of her wood sculptures here, which she's looked at the head from different perspectives. In contrast, Smith was really fascinated with the idea of the body unfolded. And so we've got one profile here, and then the head, and then the other side of the head. So it's almost like the whole head kind of almost unfolded and flat. She was working at a printmaking workshop named ULAE, and even though Smith had a background in printmaking, and this was one of the most well-known printmaking workshops, she wasn't very familiar with it, to the point that she had problems remembering the letters, the initials of it. But they invited her to work with them, and she continued to produce up to, I think, 40 different prints with them over the years. About a year after she began working with them. And the thing is that when you work with a printmaking workshop, even though if you have the background, you've got their technical expertise, you have access to their equipment, and so they help you create things that are a little bit more complicated than just what you would do at home. And so they helped her create this. Smith often uses casts in her work, and so she cast her face, and first she did it in plaster, and then that didn't work out so well in trying to translate that to print, and so then she did it in rubber. As a side note, it's kind of interesting, with her casting and everything, growing up, her father had made a death cast of her grandmother, and so she grew up, I guess, with this concept of casting, and she continues to use that in her sculptures as well. She'll cast her body parts and reuse them. motifs or objects that have a lot of rich associations. And so for the imagery of hair is rich in that sense. For example, Kiki is named for Santa Chiara, and she cut her hair, the saint cut her hair as a sign of piety to renounce the material world. And so Smith's been interested in also the martyrs and saints and the relics that are collected, different body parts, whether it's Santa Chiara's hair that's preserved and kind of weird. Also, hair brings to mind Victorian practices of creating mourning jewelry, like when you're grieving for somebody, you might take some of their hair and have it woven into necklaces or bracelets or rings, and that was a memory of her. So she likes these rich associations. We're going to make a jump in time here. We have two works that are out in the main gallery, but before we go there, we're going to look at a much later work that's still in here before we walk out. The two works in the gallery are kind of contemporary with the hair print and black and white. But this is from 2000. This is entitled Tears to Lewis Carroll. And at this point, Smith has kind of moved away from using the body, the female body, as the sole subject. She began to be interested in fairy tales and myths. She grew up with her father's 19th century children's book collection, and so she became fascinated with Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures Underground, which I guess was the first manuscript for Alice in Wonderland. She also did a series of Little Red Riding Hood as well. So basically tales and myths featuring female protagonists on their journey. And so this is at a point when after Alice has grown to 9 feet tall and has cried and created this pool of tears, and then she's shrunken down to about the size of a mouse, and so she's almost to the point of drowning in her pool of tears, and inadvertently also some of these animals have fallen into the pool as well. And Smith is interested in doing images with humans and their relationship with nature, so sometimes, and our kind of inadvertent actions. I think basically she wanted to simplify her printmaking. We'll see one in the gallery, which is fairly complex and using different materials. She really wanted to focus just on her drawing in this time period in this body of work. And she kind of went from really enjoying drawing things like hair, and that evolved into drawing feathers and fur and then animals in general. And this was also done at ULAE. She used the largest plate that they had that would fit on their press. I'm not very big, but you can get a sense of how big this plate actually is. And so when I say the plate, it goes from paper to the imagery. And so that's one single copper plate that she's used. So that's one of the advantages of working with a printmaking workshop. So all of the printmaking itself, all the etching and aqua tint and dry print that she's doing is in the black ink. And then she chose to do washes of, watercolor, very faintly, again inspired by Victorian drawings during that time period. I think of sometimes children's books as being pretty whimsical, but Kiki Smith being Kiki Smith, it kind of translates sort of the peril and anxiety in the scene. Alice is leading the way, and I'm not sure if the animals are chasing her, but they're also kind of looking out at us, so perhaps we're part of the chase as well. And so that one was from 2000, and we can go out into the gallery and look at two more pieces by Smith. collections from our permanent collection all by women artists. And so this is a great opportunity to see works by Kiki Smith and her predecessors and her contemporaries and people following them as well. What you'll see though through it is a lot of artists working in the 70s and 80s, just prior to Smith and while she's working. I wanted to point out a couple of kind of comparisons on the way. During the women's movement, a lot of female artists were trying to kind of depict the female experience, and as we kind of saw with Smith's work. So a lot of times it dealt with dealing with materials that weren't traditionally used. For example, if we look behind us, fiber art is one, so taking things off of the room and creating sculptures. I mean, art has been historically kind of hierarchical. Painting and sculpture made out of stone and out of bronze and metal were more traditional, and oftentimes fiber and other glasswork were kind of deemed as more craft. And so a lot of artists in the 1970s during the feminist art movement used and embraced a lot of these materials in their artwork, materials that were traditionally associated with women. So we have here in Betty Fishman, who was a Fort Wayne artist, using like lace, which might be something that women would create, and embracing that in their artwork. So I just want you to kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we look at a couple of Kiki Smith. This is the only three-dimensional work that we have by Smith. This is entitled Little Mountain, and Smith really enjoys working in collaborative situations. She has worked in printmaking presses where you're working with master printers. She's worked in foundries to create bronze sculptures, but also she's gone to the Pilchuck Glass Studio several times to work on this piece. So this is, for example, a cast glass piece, and this was from 1996. So we're going back in time a little bit from Alice Wonderland. And she's done a range of works where she's isolated the body parts. You know, she'll do things like the stomach in glass, or she'll do feet. She's even done sculptures of tears, the rib cage in terracotta, and yet here we have the form of a female breast, just a single one, but and it's not really, it's very naturalistic looking, but we don't have flesh tones, so I tend to focus more on it as an object, on the shape, and the fact that it's called Little Mountain. And what it brings to mind, to me at least, is that connection, maybe in the romantic time period, of women being connected with nature. Nature being life, having a life force, generating life. You see that in the different seasons. And a lot of times in paintings during the romantic time period, you would see women placed out in nature to compare the female, the woman's ability to create life and equating that with nature. And then if we look at one final work by Kiki Smith, we have some of the same themes, or maybe comparisons going on at the same time. This is entitled Worm. I think this is from 1992 or so. And this is one that I said was a little bit more, proving to be a little bit more complicated in its construction. We have like a worm-like figure, actually made up of different body parts that she's blown up and photographed, ending with maybe that's the artist's face at the tip, maybe conflating the idea of Eve and the snake, but it is entitled Worm. And so again, we have Smith connecting women, which we have an image of her in a fetal position, and she really hadn't put the body all back together again until the late 1980s. But anyways, we have that comparison between nature and the female body again in this piece. Worms. She's often attracted to animals that are often kind of overlooked, worms and bats. And when you have worms, if you cut them, they'll with the female experience. So we have really delicate flowers that she's cut out. Just the background is cut out, pierced, and we have these delicate strings. We have marble paper. So I think that, like the feminist art movement, she embraced images and motifs that were connected with it.
We don't have any questions, but we've had a lot of viewers, so thank you for doing that.
Yeah, and so I hope you'll come back and go through the exhibition. This really is a great opportunity to see women artists, and it goes on through September 13th.